those convicted of terror offences should be kept in prison until we are absolutely sure that they are no longer a threat. This individual, and I'm going to put this question first to Michael Mansfield, QC. This individual, Usman Khan, been convicted of terror offences, but was allowed out, it seems, without appearing before the parole board, halfway through his sentence at 8 years. These are two separate questions, but firstly, how could he be allowed out without his threat being assessed?
Well, he shouldn't have been. There has been an oversight. It's going to be reviewed. What is interesting about this particular case is that originally he had an indeterminate sentence, not a fixed term, under the terms of which he would not have been allowed out without a parole board hearing and an assessment about dangerousness, something that the courts have to do regularly. Now, when the Court of Appeal changed the sentence to a fixed term of 16, which, owing to legislation, meant that at the halfway stage he might be released, the court itself, Lord Justice Leveson, made the specific point that in this case there should be a parole board review, and he would have expected it. So the big question here is, why did that not happen? And the second point I'd want to make is parole and review is extremely important, but we've had austerity and cuts in the prison service, parole board, police service, and so forth. The ability to conduct an assessment with a specialised or dedicated prison officer, which hasn't happened, the government insisted that would happen, until you have that infrastructure that can make the assessment, of course, it's very difficult to let people out, and I don't think they should, unless there should be.
But Michael Mansfield, let me put this to you.
Let
me put this to you. The probation service is creaking at the seams. Massive reduction in probation officers, and they're struggling to cope. The prison officers dramatically cut as well in the last 10 years. Police numbers dramatically cut. All these things clearly are contributory factors. At the same time as we've had a massive rise in jihadism in this country, and we know that there are 74 convicted jihadis who've been released, like Usman Khan, in the last couple of years, of which one has just been rearrested following this attack because they went to his house and found some evidence, apparently, he may be plotting another attack. So this is a real and present danger from a kind of unprecedented threat of these jihadists, at the same time as all the system that we have in place to deal with it is creaking at the seams. Fundamentally, though, it comes down to this. If you don't let him out, he can't re-offend. And the question most British people, I think, are asking today is, how does a guy who's an al-Qaeda terrorist, who admitted his offences, who was working with a large group of people in Stoke-on-Trent and London on planning a terror camp, on planning attacks on Boris Johnson, the London Stock Exchange, the US Embassy in London, how do people who are convicted al-Qaeda terrorists ever get released in 8 years?
Well, I've answered the question already, and so have you. There should have been a parole board review, and he should not have been let out unless that board and the review assessed him as being safe. And I've already made the point, as you have. All the services, that the infrastructure to make that assessment on behalf of the community is just not there. So you have to look back over the last 10 years, a serial cuts all the way down the line, and that's the reason that this may have happened. Also, there's an oversight here. Furthermore, where are the security services? Low level? Well, how do they make that assessment? I mean, we're worried about government intrusion and gathering of data. And here you have a situation in which the security services must have known about this person.
Right.
And must have, they've got the facilities to have surveillance.
I do think that the fundamental question this time is not about at what point did they come out, because whether or not he came out at 8 years or 16 years, all you're doing is postponing the inevitable. He was going to do what he was going to do.
Well, don't let him out then.
Let me finish.
Well, hang on.
But the answer is not the
You can't just say that. Well, don't let him out then.
Let me finish my point.
If it's inevitable, don't let him out. In America, if you're an al-Qaeda terrorist and you get caught plotting terror attacks, you don't come out.
One of the people that tackled that man, a couple of days ago, was a convicted murderer. who was at the right time at the right place. Look, there's something that we need to do with the sentencing. But the question I have to ask is, what security measures are put in place when convicted terrorists are released? That is the key question. So when we talk about probation officers...
But you just said it was inevitable he would kill when he came out.
Let me finish.
So I say, why are we letting him out?
Let me finish. If our probation officers that are assigned to these convicted terrorists, are they trained or skilled in finding out, in knowing what the telling points are? Do we, for instance...
Or are they being played?
Or being played.
Because some prisoners
we have
may
to bear
do
in mind that
Tick the right boxes.
The intelligence community cannot deal with terrorism by themselves.
All right, Ian Ashton.
So, but let me make this point, please. Why isn't there, when I say they can't do it by themselves, I mean that they also need the help of civilians. So why isn't there the equivalent of a sex offenders register for convicted terrorists?
Well, OK, Ian Ashton, you were the senior advisor at Counter-Extremism Project, an expert in Islamic extremism inside prisons. The most stark takeaway from what Dr. Shephard just said there is it was inevitable this guy was going to kill when he got out, to which my obvious response is, well, why let him out? I mean, as I say, in America, if you were convicted of an al-Qaeda or ISIS terror plot, you wouldn't get out of prison. You wouldn't better re-offend. So why do we let these people out again?
I think it's important to say a number of things. First of all, there are approximately this morning 221 prisoners in custody in relation to offences they've committed under the Terrorism Act. That's not a very large number. And 3.5 odd years ago, when the government asked me to look into this, my view was that the prison service was, at that time, completely incapable, and the probation service, of managing the risk. So I made a number of recommendations, including one that was that the security service, the police and the prison service, should, from the first night in custody to the last night in the community sentence, have total control over this small and, in my opinion, completely knowable cohort of people. The problem with what you're saying, Piers, is we don't have 220-odd oven-ready mass murderers ready to go. Right. The police and the security service have been extremely successful and increasingly successful over the last number of years in scooping up people further and further upstream from actually committing an attack. So these people aren't the same. I completely agree with you.
So you mean that they might have been convicted of terror offences, but they're low-level terror offences,
but on a much... Yes,
and you
indeed.
shouldn't therefore keep them in prison?
Well, hang on a second. What we should do is have a much more sophisticated, risk-based assessment and interventions, individualised interventions and treatment. We don't have any of that in custody at the minute. We don't really have anything going through...
The only guaranteed way to stop these people doing what Usman Khan did on Friday is if you are... He admitted his terror offence. He didn't even try to deny it. If you are a self-confessed al-Qaeda or ISIS terrorist plotting mass murder in this country, then you don't come out of prison.
Hang on. I just want to talk to Moazzam Beg. You were in Guantanamo, where there are prisoners accused of terror, accused of terrorist offences, who face no prospect of getting out.
Yeah.
Should you be in prison
I think the Guantanamo
for longer, forever?
Well, the Guantanamo situation is totally different because people are held there without charge or trial.
Right.
So right. But here, I mean, I was in Belmarsh in 2013.
Just tell us your story very quickly, because people may not be aware.
In 2013, I was actually arrested and put into Belmarsh high security for sending a generator to one of the Free Syrian Army rebels. And I don't know if you'll probably remember that you actually came to Belmarsh during that time to visit, I think, Antigua.
I did,
So at that time, the British government had sent over 1,000 generators to the same people that I'd sent a generator to. So had they had their way, I'd have been convicted as a terrorist. And you would now be saying, well, the key should be thrown away for somebody like me.
Yes.
So not everybody that's accused of terrorism is actually plotting to murder innocent people.
No, but in this case, there was a trial.
Yes.
They were found guilty. They pled... Usman Khan pled guilty to being an al-Qaeda terrorist.
Agreed.
They knew that there were plots with this group in Stoke and London to commit mass atrocities. The Stock Exchange, the US Embassy, Boris Johnson personally, they were planning to create a terror camp, I think in Pakistan. All this was laid bare. And the judge in that case said they were highly dangerous people. He said that Usman Khan was particularly dangerous because he was more intelligent than the others and more strategic in his thinking. And yet here we are 9 years later, and the same guy has been let out and has committed mass murder.
Because there have been a series of failures of policy. Now, for example, in 2017, there were a series of attacks that took place. I think the largest number of attacks in 1 year under the Tory government. And the person who carried out one of the attackers on London Bridge, Khurram Butt, his brother was in receipt of £10,000 of Prevent money, so under the Prevent programme to stop radicalisation. He couldn't even stop his own brother. So what you've seen is a series of anti-terror legislations passed in this country, the likes of which we never even saw at the height of the RA campaign when they were bombing 10 Downing Street.
Yeah.
We've had laws and wars on terror passed one after the other, and at the end of that process...
Hang on.
Wait a minute, though.
At the end of that process, we're still less safe than we've ever been.
We have also faced an unprecedented threat on a massively different scale to what was going on even with the IRA.
Yeah.
And Ian Edson, you made a number of recommendations to the government. When you hear Boris Johnson say, this is all Labour's fault, what's your reaction?
I'm really quite depressed about this my dad's bigger than your dad arms race of punitive sentencing. That's actually missing the point. What we need to do is make sure that people who are sentenced for the most heinous crimes in this country, people who believe they've got theological permission to go out and murder British citizens, are not released until they're safe. And I'll say something about, if I may, about sentencing.
So he should have stayed on an indeterminate sentence then?
Indeterminate sentences for public protection have been abolished, and rightly so, because they were a moral outrage. There were people stuck in prison with absolutely no chance of doing the very things they were supposed to do to keep them safe.
On those
and they're still
sentences.
safe. My view is we need to reintroduce something like that for terrorist offenders.
Yes.
And I'm afraid I don't believe, frankly, that the parole board is capable of making those decisions. I think the parole board's capability has to be augmented in this case by other professionals who will come in and who will make decisions on people and their dangerousness.
Well, let me bring
and not release them.
Let me bring back Michael Mansfield on that point. Michael Mansfield, you've dealt with a lot of hardened criminals in your time, including, I would imagine, terrorists. Usman Khan appeared to be very convincing in persuading people right across the board that he was a reformed character, that he had been de-radicalised. He wrote letters to say this. He was in many ways a model guy when he came out of prison. He was attending this offenders conference where they were learning how to be reintegrated into normal life and so on. He was very plausible. A parole board may not have even picked up anything from him that would stop them releasing him. The problem surely comes back to the sentencing.
Well, sentencing isn't just a one-day exercise at the point at which they are sentenced. And as the judges have pointed out, you need to have a constant review. You don't wait for a parole board, which may be many years down the line and isn't very effective. Now, the point I've been making is that the government in 2016 made a recommendation, and in fact, it hasn't happened, which was besides the parole board, forget the parole board for the moment. What inside prison there needs to be, and they made provision to do it, but they haven't done it, a dedicated prison officer, in fact, who has the job and the task of getting to know the individual prisoner for which he's given care. And he's in one of the positions, he's not the only thing, but one of the ways in which you assess whether you're being deceived at a parole board. I quite agree. That's very easy. But what I don't agree with is because the infrastructure, I said it at the beginning, the infrastructure isn't there through the cuts. There must be ways of assessing whether somebody's dangerous. Of course, at the end of the day, after many, many years, it may be impossible to do that, but that's a risk we have to take. You cannot lock people up for the rest of their lives just because there might be a risk or the heinous crime. And it's not just terrorism. We're concentrating on terrorism. Yeah. What are you doing about serial killers, serious rape, robbery, and all the rest of it?
Well,
once you get into this arena,
let me come back on that point.
It's not just about terrorism.
The Yorkshire Ripper is never let out of prison, right? We don't let him out because he was a mass murderer and we don't trust him not to reoffend. Yet we let Al-Qaeda terrorists out.
No,
yes, exactly, but there are assessments being made.
Well, there are assessments being made, but this guy clearly... Look, let's bring in Dr. Shola again. I mean, you can make all the assessments you like once they're released. Right. But once you release these people onto the streets after 8 years, there's no way in a million years that a radicalised Al-Qaeda terrorist involved in the kind of activity this guy was doing is going to de-radicalise in 8 years.
Well, except there's
no evidence that ever happened.
Exactly, but that's where you're wrong. That's where you're wrong.
Where's the evidence?
No, that's where you're wrong. There are terrorists. There are people who've changed and who've become valuable members of the society. I think you're right for us to ask the questions about sentencing. But if you're taking the approach that the answer is to lock them up and throw it, That's not the right answer.
Why?
It's not the solution.
Why?
Okay, let's look at the risk they pose in prison. So you leave them in there and they expose other people to radicalization, other people who did not commit heinous crimes or who
Well, on
commit
that
heinous
basis, you
crimes
wouldn't
about to
imprison
leave.
anybody, would you?
But
Here's the
that's the
question.
point. You can't just leave them.
The argument is that never release the prisoners. If we never released terrorism prisoners, Nelson Mandela would never have been released.
Thank
If
you.
you never released the prisoners, you would never have the good.
Nelson Mandela was a political prisoner.
but who believed
He was
believed in
treated
armed
as a
struggle. Who
terrorist.
believed in armed struggle
If
was
you are an
convicted for
active
terrorism.
member of Al-Qaeda or ISIS and you are planning mass murder,
I agree with you.
I
Of
don't
course.
understand
Of
why you
course.
cannot say,
Shouldn't be
I don't-
released from
and you
London
admit
then.
your crime when you're caught.
I don't disagree with you, but
He was convicted for that crime. That was one crime.
Yes.
About programmes for a second, please. The idea, I'm afraid, that there are sophisticated programmes that are happening inside custody to attempt to de-radicalise
not
people
happening, is it?
is a fiction.
Right.
There are very rudimentary programmes in prison, and some of them, it's quite clear there's evidence that prisoners, sophisticated terrorist offenders, are gaming the system. What we have to look at, as well as developing programmes that will avoid false compliance, for example, when people appear to be going along with things, what we must look at also is a prison system backdrop where all of this is happening, which has witnessed a collapse in security, order and control.
Yes.
It's very, very difficult to expect the prison service to respond to these highly dangerous prisoners
When
in an
assaults on
appropriate
prison
way.
officers are up, assaults
When day to
between-
day,
But Ian, don't you agree
prisoners
that's
Let me just read you
Isn't
this.
it why
This
we
was,
need
this,
civilians
was on,
to help?
this was on Twitter, I think, yesterday, or Instagram, one of the two. It was a guy who was at school with Usman Khan. Surprise, surprise. Look, it's the guy who walked around school with a picture of Osama bin Laden on the front of his planner. He used to sit in the corner of the cafe with 20 of his mates watching videos of the Twin Towers laughing. But when anyone spoke up, we were told to stop being racist. Now, you have to be very careful, right, about not stigmatising groups of people. And I completely agree, right? We have to be very careful, not least because of what happened to you, by the way, right, which was clearly outrageous. However, this guy's red flags were there at school. They manifested themselves into him signing up to a group of people who were planning mass murder. He got caught, he admitted his crime, and then we let him out after 8 years, and the first thing he does within a few months is commit the mass murder he had been plotting to do.
That goes back to my first point. What security measures were put in place with this guy?
Here's my point.
I mean,
I would blame...
cells are known to sleep for a long time before they get activated.
We can blame everybody.
I don't want to blame anybody.
No,
The only person to blame
I think we should blame people. By the way,
he's the one that committed the crime.
Dr. Charlotte, we should be blaming people. Innocent people, two young students who went to Cambridge, who had the whole of their lives ahead of them,
And
have had their lives,
rehabilitation
destroyed because we let this person back on the
Let's
this
go.
guy?
What did those two people who killed? What did they actually believe? What were they doing there? And actually, they believed in the rehabilitation.
Yes.
They believed in
That's
not
right.
retribution. So we should at least respect
And I
them.
would not agree with you
Respect
to
their
lock them
memory.
up.
As do I, but I would make an exception.
And the family have also
I would make
said
an exception in the
that
way
they don't want
but hang on.
the killing of
wasn't
their
his
relatives politicised and to be used as a
Correct.
tool to bring in knee-jerk reactions.
Hang
They've
on,
actually said
hang
that,
on.
right?
Let me just respond. Let me just respond.
But at the same time as that...
I'll come to you in a moment. Let me just respond to that. I completely believe in the rehabilitation of prisoners, right? I think it's very important that we do that, both in prison and when they come out, and we take care of people. We try and give people a second chance. I would make an exception, just as we do for serial killers like the Yorkshire Ripper and others who never come out of prison, ever. The Cray twins never came out of prison, right? We make exceptions for violent offenders all the time. We should be making exceptions for Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
But what was he convicted of?
We
He
do.
wasn't convicted of killing people.
In the case, for example,
have an hearing.
in the case, for example, of the murderers of Lee Rigby, who've had whole life orders and absolutely deserve it.
Yes.
I think one of the things that we need to just focus on sometimes, the sort of academic prison reform activist bubble, is that people are out there, the general public are out there, and they demand to be made safer.
Yes.
From a system that appears to be failing. And I mean, I absolutely agree with you. What should be foremost in our minds this morning are two amazing people who were murdered in a grotesquely ironic situation where somebody they were trying to help turned against them.
They believed in him and his rehabilitation.
Yes, but we also have to
Even if you
respond
didn't
to
believe in them.
proper public concern about how people are managed inside custody. I'm not jumping on a bandwagon. I have been waving this red flag for 3.5 years. And it is time, whoever's back in government, and I hope Robert Buckland, frankly, personally, will be back as Secretary of State for Justice,
Well, he's
for him to be
coming
able to
up.
take a grip on this situation and change it.